This Transtar 4300 uses a combination of kit supplied items, detail parts, and basic scratch building to enhance its appearance. Here's how it was done. Kit parts, and even the instruction sheets, are usually my starting point with these model truck projects. They're often more accurate than you think. For example, this instruction sheet for an Astro 95 shows an air tank at the right rear corner of the frame. And a number of years ago, I spotted this 1:1 scale Astro 95 in the field, and was able to take some reference photos, including this air tank at the right rear corner of the frame. One major difference between this and the kit part, of course, is that it's not chrome, as per the instruction sheet callout. AMT's GMC General instruction sheet shows air tanks that are fairly small in diameter and relatively long, mounted against the frame rails at the back of the truck. And although this real one is a single drive, as opposed to the dual drive represented in the kit, and also has a shorter hood, it does have the air tanks just like the kit shows them, small in diameter, relatively long, and set up against the frame rails at the back of the truck. Moving back to the Transtar 4300 project, the kit air tanks were assembled as per the instructions. However, trying to preserve the molded-on detail representing air fittings and mounting bands is much too difficult. It's much easier to simply sand the entire tank smooth, filling all seams as required, and then adding new fittings. These consist of a nut and bolt casting for the drain valve, bolt head with washer castings for straight-in fittings. These are drilled out 20 thou after they've been glued in place, and 90-degree fittings, which are made from 40 thou square styrene strip with a 20 thou diameter hole drilled partway through and glued to a small disc punched from 20 thou styrene. The kit's air tank mounting brackets were used and were installed as per the instructions, and a basic air brake system diagram was referenced to determine where to route the air lines, and this is what pointed out a discrepancy in the Ertl kit. With only 2 air tanks, there's a tank missing from the system. The majority of trucks have at least 3 air tanks, as per the diagram shown here: a primary tank, a secondary tank, and one called the wet tank, which is the tank that is supplied by the air compressor as intended to catch any condensate in the recently compressed air to keep it from contaminating the rest of the system. Some trucks have more than 3 air tanks. As an example, our fire department tankers have 5: wet tank, primary, secondary, and 2 auxiliary tanks because they're equipped with air suspension. The air brake diagram I referenced is from this Ministry of Transportation reference book, but you can also find similar diagrams online. A number of Transtar 4300 pictures I've seen show a vertical air tank mounted immediately behind the battery box, as shown here. And another example, again with a vertical air tank in the same location below the cab and immediately behind the battery box. I use this as my reference for an air tank to add to the model. Actual size of the tank was a best guess based on the space available. I used 3/8 diameter tube, which represents a tank about 9 inches in diameter, and cut it so I can make the tank 18 inches long. Telescoping sizes of tube and rod were cut, each one slightly longer than the next, to achieve this result, which when glued together creates a solid cylinder that can be chucked at the drill and easily turned down to create the domed ends. With a small amount of putty added where needed and finish sanded, the basic tank is completed and now just needs a mounting bracket. A strip was cut from 20 thou styrene sheet to match the width of the frame rail, and one piece was heat formed to match the diameter of the tank. The other piece received holes for 20 thou styrene rod, which will represent bolt heads. and the air tank was attached and the bolt heads added. Bolt heads were sanded flush on the back side of the mounting plate so it can be glued to the frame, and two air fittings were made using the 40 thou square styrene strip and 20 thou styrene sheet discs. Nut and bolt casting on the bottom represents the drain valve. 30 thou styrene rod straps were added to the vertical air tank, and a larger fitting was added on the front side from 60 thou styrene strip, drilled slightly larger for a larger diameter hose. This would be the air line coming from the compressor. Now it's time to make new air tank straps to replace the molded on detail that was sanded off when the tanks were cleaned up. Start by taking 20 thou styrene rod, cutting short pieces, and flattening one end as shown. Glue these to 10 thou by 30 thou styrene strip. The purpose of flattening the ends is not so much to create a prototypical appearance as it is to make it easier to glue the pieces on. Holes to receive the 20 thou diameter rod are drilled in the space between the air tanks. Attach one air tank and then glue its matching pair of straps to the frame, letting the glue dry thoroughly before moving on to the next step, which is threading the end of the strap around the air tank, under the frame, and up over the other side, where weight is applied with self-locking tweezers to maintain tension on the strap while you glue it in place to the top of the frame rail. The other air tank is done the same way and is a much simpler process because access is much easier to this end of the air tank brackets. Being a complete subassembly, the vertical air tank is easy to attach. Simply glue it to the frame rail. Here, I've temporarily attached the battery box frame and the hydraulic tank to make sure the vertical air tank is centered in the opening. The only step left to do is to run some air lines, and to keep things organized, I take 332 styrene tube, drill it out 1/16 of an inch, and cut off slices about 40 thou long. These are glued in place where needed along the inside of the frame rails and represent the brackets bolted to the frame on the prototype to keep wiring and air lines organized. Although not 100% accurate, they're easy to make and they're reasonably convincing once everything's assembled and painted. One wire, representing an air line, has been run through these brackets and attached to the wet tank. A larger wire represents the supply line to the wet tank and will be attached to the air compressor on the engine at final assembly. Looking at the inside of the frame, with 3 air lines installed, supply line to the wet tank, and lines running from the wet tank to the primary and secondary tanks. That's as far as we'll take it for this installment. Looking at all the various parts that make up an air brake system is quite a large undertaking, and it's easier handled in smaller installments, much like building the various sub-assemblies on the model. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Hopefully you've picked up something you can put to use in your next project, and keep in mind that these techniques aren't limited just to air brake systems, but can be used to add all kinds of different details to your models.